Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Dan Malthrop. I'm the Chief Executive here at the City Club. I'm also a proud member. It's my privilege to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Margaret Raymond. Her name's actually Margaret, but she goes by Mackie, and she insists that nobody call her Margaret. She's the director of the Center for Research on Education Outcomes at Stanford University. She's joining us to discuss the findings of a study looking at 6 years' worth of data on charter school performance in the state of Ohio. Charter schools are quickly becoming a defining feature of the public education landscape across the nation. Here in Ohio, public charters were introduced in 1997, and over the past 2 decades, charters have grown significantly. Today, they educate more than 120,000 children throughout Ohio and 18,000 students in Cleveland. To provide just a little bit of context for today's discussion, it's worth taking a quick detour to define a charter school. In short, charters have 3 distinct characteristics. First, they're schools of choice, by which we mean that to attend a charter, a parent must make an affirmative decision to enroll their child in that school. Second, charters operate independent of traditional districts and of some state regulations. These freedoms give charters greater flexibility in how they select staff and select curriculum. Third, charters are held contractually accountable for their results by a charter school authorizer. In addition to those characteristics, it's also worth noting that charters receive significantly less public financial support than district schools. The money they do receive, however, does come out of district budgets. The principle, though, the notion of charter schools, it's all fairly simple. Empower parents with choice, give schools freedom, and then hold schools accountable, and higher student achievement will follow. At least that was the idea. But how does that idea stack up against reality? Are charters actually producing better results than their district counterparts, or are their results worse? The answers vary, especially here in Ohio. One way to answer this question is by analyzing data on charters. And since 1999, Stanford University's Center for Research on Education Outcomes, commonly known as CREDO, has been the nation's foremost independent evaluator of charter school performance. Today, we'll hear how Ohio's charters are faring as Dr. Raymond presents the results of CREDO's newest study, which was produced with support from the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. Dr. Raymond has served as the director of CREDO since its inception in 1999. Prior to joining Stanford, she held faculty positions in the political science and economics departments at the University of Rochester, where she also did her graduate work. Ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Margaret Raymond of Stanford University.
Well, all right. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and I just want to say a special thank you for my friends who have come out today. I really appreciate you being here. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to share the results of our study, which was just released yesterday, and appreciate the media coverage that's already begun on this. Let's see. Yes. Does it work? It's sleeping. Hold on just a moment. All right. So the introduction already gave you the overview of charter schools, and I think that's been very helpful, and also expressed appreciation for the supporters of this study, the Thomas B. Fordham Foundation's Fordham Institute. We also want to acknowledge the help that we've received from the Ohio Alliance of Public Charter Schools. They've provided a considerable amount of time and explanation for us to better understand the local context of charter schooling here in Ohio, and we appreciate that. And our third partner in this effort is the Ohio Department of Education, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. I'm going to share a little bit about how we go about doing this study, because I think it helps you understand a lot of the contrasts that we face when we think about charter schools in the United States. For those of you who are unfamiliar with charters, there are over 6,000 of them operating across the country, educating more than 2 million students. That's about 5% of the American student population in K-12 education. So, let's get started. CREDO has as sort of its focus trying to understand and evaluate the cognitive skills that students gain through public education. It's not that there aren't other outcomes that are relevant and important and even measurable, things like socio-emotional development or ability to cooperate and work in groups or resiliency or independence, but we think that those things are secondary to the the kind of knowledge foundation that students need in order to build successful lives. So we focus on what do kids know. For the past 15 years, CREDO has made its mark by providing independent and nonpartisan and rigorous analysis of promising education reform programs in American K-12 education. We're not pro-charter, we're not anti-district, and we're not the reverse of those things. What we are is we're for great schools for all kids. And we know that we've hit that sweet spot because we have both detractors and supporters on both sides of the public reform debate. So we have a number of questions that we want to try to answer about how charter schools are doing educating their students. And when you see the initials TPS, that is not the Ohio local version of Toledo Public Schools. That's traditional public schools. These are the district schools with which charter schools compete. And we want to know how they're doing in terms of helping students progress in their accumulation of cognitive knowledge. And we want to know if there are some students that are better served than others by attending charter schools. And we want to know in Ohio how charter management organizations, those networks of charter schools, are doing compared to both independent charter schools and the traditional public schools in their communities. So let me start by giving you an overview of who the charter school population is. And what you're looking at this slide is 3 different stacks of student profiles. The one on the left, traditional public schools, is the profile of all students in public education in Ohio. The middle column, which we call feeders, are those public schools that lose students to charter schools. So if a student transfers from a traditional public school to a charter school, that traditional public school then is considered a feeder of the charters. And then on the right-hand side, we have the column of the profile of charter schools. And you can see immediately that there are some important distinctions. Most notably, the proportion of students in charter schools that live in poverty is substantially higher than for the state as a whole, and more importantly, than the schools from which those students are naturally drawn. So we have 75%, nearly 3/4 of our kids in charter schools are living in poverty. The other thing to note is that the population in charter schools is proportionately more black, both compared to their feeder schools and to their, traditional public schools as a whole. And consequently, the share of white students is lower. So you can see automatically that the demography is a little bit different. There are 2 other points I'd like to share with you, and that has to do with English language learners and special education students. Charters across the country are often accused of enrolling smaller shares of these student groups, and in that way advantaging their student populations, and somehow therefore that's what's attributing to the difference in results that are observed. But in Ohio, we don't have those differences. The share of special education students and the share of English language learners is equivalent across the 3 groups of schools that we've looked at. Well, why is this demography important? Well, students come to school with different kinds of educational endowments based on their backgrounds. They might have differences in their basic command of English, vocabulary, phonetic awareness, numeracy, and so on. And these differences in knowledge affect the absolute level of knowledge that they have, both when they enter school and continuing on. So if we looked at just how much kids know, in other words, their achievement, we would be muddling the differences in their background with the differences that schooling contributes to their knowledge gaining. So we can't look at achievement and know how schools are doing. And because the demography of charter schools is so much different than the other sets of schools, we can't do school-to-school comparisons either. So our work here at CREDO is to try to figure out how to take an honest snapshot of what's going on in charter schools. The fairest test is to try to isolate what schools actually contribute to the academic progress of students from year to year. So instead of looking at absolute levels of knowledge, we look at academic progress or growth. In order to do that, we need to be able to track students from one year to the next and see how their learning changes between those 2 time periods. We mentioned in the introduction that there are 6 years of data. Well, it doesn't take much to understand that that means there are 5 periods of growth that we can look at in our data window. Not all students are available to look at for all the windows. The charter marketplace is highly dynamic. Schools are opening, schools are expanding, schools are replicating. Students are moving in and out of charter schools. And so what we do then is to ask a very basic question. What does a student in a charter school learn in the course of 1 year? And how does that compare to what that student would have learned if they had gone to one of those schools that have contributed students to that school? So what are those feeder kids looking like in terms of their academic growth? And we use statistical models to isolate all of the various demographic differences that you see there, so that we isolate the contributions of schooling to a typical child. And that's the work that we're trying to do in this study. I mentioned earlier that we have a partnership with the Ohio Department of Education, and we're very grateful for that opportunity. We, as a result of that partnership, are able to obtain student-level data, 1 record per student per year for all of the students in Ohio, all the way back to the 2005-2006 school year. And that information includes not only information about their personal characteristics, whether they're English language learners, whether they are eligible for free and reduced price lunch, which is our proxy for whether students are living in poverty, whether they are special education students, whether they're male or female, but it also includes their test scores on the Ohio standardized achievement tests, which are administered to students in grades 3 through 8 and grade 10 every year. So based on that array of testing, we are able then to line up students in both the charter school sector and in the traditional sector and start to do what we call a twin study. Now, you know about these from the medical literature where twins, for whatever reason, end up in different environments, but because that twin background controls for all kinds of differences, you can isolate more effectively what the medical treatment has been. Well, we take that same approach, and what we do then is in that group of feeder schools for each charter school, we look for students that match the characteristics of every single student in the charter. All right? So we're essentially looking for twins that look like them on all of those attributes that I just mentioned. And we only select those twins that have the exact same starting score on a baseline test. So essentially, you've got one student in the charter school, and you may have a multiple set of students who are twins out of that feeder school population. And then we roll the camera forward after they've had their year of schooling, charter school and traditional public schools, and if there's a multiple set of records for the twins, we average that second test score. So then you get one average gain for the traditional public school twin versus the gain that you have for the charter school student, right? It's like Noah's Ark. You're just going 2 by 2. And our question then is, how does that growth increment for the charter school student compare to his twin? Because we do that, we're able to eliminate a lot of the other selection concerns that plague other kinds of studies. We're not changing the populations at all. For every student that we include in our study, we've got a twin, and we're lucky enough to have been able to match 79% of the students in Ohio charter schools for whom there are tested results. So with that as our background, let's get into our findings. This chart shows you our top-line results, and we've taken a snapshot of charter school performance in Ohio twice. We released a study in 2009, and we have the study that we released yesterday that runs up through the 12-13 school year. And I have to tell you that this does not work. I'm having a tech challenge.
Let me see if I can get it.
Okay. We're just going to keep going. So let me explain what we're looking at here. The 0 line, where I have that arrow pointed, in this particular test is looking at the average gains of the traditional public school twins. So we've taken all of the comparison records and we've said, what does that student performance look like? And then we've compared the charter school performance against that benchmark. Clear? We're going to be doing that same zero line for a number of the slides that I'm going to show you, although the group that represents the zero line will change, and I'll explain it as we go along. So you'll notice that there are some strange numbers like negative 0.1 and negative 0.6. And I would like a show of hands of how many people wake up every morning and think in standard deviation units? Okay, the sad news is that there are some hands going up. All right. Well, thank you. It works. Great. Well, we don't think most people know what standard deviations units look like, so we searched for a way to translate that into real-world units. And so what we're doing here is describing days of learning, and I just want to take a moment to explain what that is so that you will understand then what we're talking about when we say days of learning. If you think about the absolute average kid in Ohio from one year to the next, so he's in the 50th percentile one year and absolutely in the 50th percentile the next year, we arbitrarily call that amount of learning 180 days, because that's the typical standard school year. So the baseline here is against 180 days of learning that a traditional public school kid would get, what does the charter school student get in equivalent days of learning? If they have exactly the same effects, if there's no difference between charter schools and traditional schools, they basically get the same 180 days. But if in fact the results of our statistical models suggest that they're gaining a positive advantage relative to charter schools, we've taken that difference and we've translated into days of additional learning as though that charter school student had gone to school for 120 days or 140 days. And if it's negative, then we say they didn't get quite 180 days. They've lost days of learning relative to that standard. That seems pretty easy, right? It's a whole lot better than negative 0.6, I promise you. So here's what we found. We found in 2009 that charter schools and traditional public schools had about the same amount of academic progress or growth in a year in reading. But in math, they found that charter schools did not create the same amount of learning, and in fact, the number was about 43 days fewer days of learning in mathematics than their traditional school counterparts. Roll forward to the 2013 study, the one that was released yesterday, and we find that the math difference has not changed. They're still learning 43 days less in math, but now the effect in reading is a little bit more significant. They're gaining 14 fewer days of learning a year in reading. Now this is for all of the students in all of the 5 growth periods. So this is an aggregate result for all charter school students in Ohio over the 5-year period. But when we break it out by growth period and look at one growth period at a time, what you can see is that in reading, we progress from a loss of about 22 days to only a loss of about 7 days in the most recent time period. And we go from about a 74-day loss in learning in math up to a loss only of about 36 days. And so both of those trajectories are on a positive rise, but that pace of change is very slow compared to what we see in other sectors. So not only do you have a loss in learning, but the retirement of that loss is a very, very modest pace. So if that pace of change is continued, we will end up with break even with the traditional public schools in about 1 year for reading and about 3 years for math. Well, let's go on. We have much more to share. Here, we're looking at what happens in 4 different cities that we've broken out. And the thing to share with you is that Cleveland charter schools are actually creating a positive result in contrast to the state as a whole of about 14 days of learning in both reading and math. Going back to the state, you can see that those effects are very different depending on the grade span. And the only thing that's really positive story here is that charter schools that are middle schools end up with about 34 36 extra days of learning in math and about 42 extra days of learning in reading and about 42 extra days of learning in math. High schools and multi-level schools, these are either elementary plus middle or middle plus high school, are in fact not having the same effects, and elementary schools are practically no different than what we see in the traditional sector. Locationally, you might be interested, though, in the results, because remember that the state results were -02 and -06. Here, what we're finding is that the urban schools do better on average than the state as a whole. That is not something that we typically see. We typically see suburban charter schools doing a little bit better and the urban schools falling a little bit behind when we look in other parts of the country. So here, urban charter schools, and this includes all of the 8 cities, 7 fewer days of learning and reading, and 22 fewer days in math. We wanted to look at whether schools that were affiliated with charter management organizations, networks, were doing better. And what we were able to see is that in neither subject does affiliation with CMOs in Ohio on average produce strong results. I can tell you that that's not the case for the CMOs that have a strong presence in Cleveland. We're not naming any names, but I know from earlier studies that there are some strong performers, CMOs here. I also have to say that they are atypical of the CMO results that we saw for the rest of the state. We can give you a little bit more of a background in terms of comparing what charter school CMO affiliated students learn compared to their independent school results. And again, it's that middle school that's giving you the story. And unfortunately, in elementary school, this is where we see the biggest gap in learning between CMOs and independent charter schools. Okay, well, let's get into some of the student breakouts. And I need to do a little moment of setup here just to let you know. We obviously care a lot about all students, but when we looked at that demography and we saw that there were disproportionate numbers of black students and disproportionate numbers of students in poverty, we wanted to take an extra special focus on those. So what you're seeing here is the learning of black students in Ohio and in the 4 cities compared to white students in the traditional public schools that compete with those charter schools. So these are the white TPS twins. And you can see that the learning of black students across the state is not as strong as for white students. The relevant point, though, is whether black students in charter schools learn more or less or the same than black students in traditional public schools. So the next slide gives you that picture. And in fact, what you see is that across the state, there's no difference between charters and traditional public schools for black students. But when we look at Cleveland, there's a very strong difference, and that equates to 28 days 36 days of learning in math, and even though that's a positive trend in reading, it's not statistically significant. Well, we can do the same thing for other student breakout groups, so let's take a look. Here, our focus is on Hispanic students. And what I would point out to you is we have the same example of smaller learning gains in a year's time for Hispanic students, but you can see from this slide that it's much more uneven effects across the state than what we've seen for black students, much less consistent. And while it is a significant effect for Cleveland, the question here is whether Cleveland charter schools do better with Hispanic students than Hispanic students are learning in their Cleveland district schools. And here's the comparison, and it turns out that this is one of the places where Cleveland charter schools could really step up their game. The effects, again, are not significant in reading, but they're a loss of 72 days of learning in math for Hispanic students. Students in poverty, we have that same negative pattern across the state. Students in poverty learn less than their non-poverty students in traditional public settings. And that's true in Cleveland as well. But when we look at the marginal effect of head-to-head comparisons for these students, we find that in Cleveland there is no statistically significant difference in the amount of learning for kids in poverty. But hang on, because remember, 75% of the kids in charter schools are in poverty and 45% of the students are black. So what we wanted to do was to take both of those together and look at students who are both black and in poverty. And you will notice, first off, that these bars are a lot bigger than either the poverty bars or the black bars were when we looked at them just in a standalone basis. So these are the additive effects of both of these educational challenges. And what's remarkable to me is that in both settings, the size of the bars in Cleveland are larger than in other parts of the state. And that, I think, is something worth looking at regardless of sector. But when we take the head-to-head comparison in Cleveland, we find that black students in poverty in charter schools in Cleveland gain about 36 days in reading and 50 days extra learning in math. And that compares favorably to the state results, which were 28 days in reading and 22 in math. So we're very close to being done. We have one more student result to share, and that's Hispanic students in poverty. And the marginal effect here is significant and negative for Cleveland, and it's a little bit of the middle point in the story. For the state as a whole, there's no difference in reading scores, but there is a negative learning gap for charter school Hispanic students in poverty compared to their peers in traditional public schools. And although the bars look big for Dayton, because there are small numbers of Hispanic students in poverty across the state, those numbers in Dayton are not statistically significantly different from zero. So the one thing I will say about this is that it's a difference for us. Usually Hispanic students have larger learning losses in reading, not in math. And here you'll see that the gaps are primarily a math gap. So we know that public policy is made at the school level. And so what we want to do is then aggregate up these student level findings to the school level and find out how are schools doing, charter schools versus the equivalent behavior of the twins, which we then roll up to be a virtual school. And what you're looking at here is judgments that we make about whether a charter school on average is statistically better or statistically worse or not statistically different than the counterfactual schooling effect of their twins. And for the state as a whole, 19% of the schools were better than their peer schools in reading, and 27.7% were positive, statistically better than their peer schools in math. At the other end, though, we end up with nearly 20% significantly worse in reading and about 24% significantly worse in math. You can see from the Cleveland numbers that the numbers skew positive for Cleveland, and we're happy to be able to report that. This compares sort of favorably to the national results that we released last year. Nationally, the top end for reading was 25%, and the bottom percent was 19% for reading. And for math, the top end was 29%, and the bottom end was 31%. So the whole spectrum of performance for Cleveland charter schools is shifted to the positive side of this, and we're happy to see that. Now, this is back to the state as a whole, and these are my last two slides. I want to just highlight for you that at the end of the day, it's not just how much students grow and how much they grow relative to their twin, but it's also how much they actually know. And the closer you get to graduation, the more important cognitive knowledge and achievement is. So we have altered that last slide, which is just looking head-to-head, school to school, on growth, and we've anchored all of those schools in what we call the quad table. And what we've done is to take not only their growth relative to their traditional public school alternative, and it's either significantly less growth, somewhat less growth, somewhat positive growth, and much more positive growth in the four columns, and also anchored each school by where they sit in the statewide achievement distribution. So the 50th percentile is the average achievement for the state. 70th percentile is obviously above that, and the 30th is below that. The news here is a little bit grim. And what I want to point out to you is that while there are some fine examples of schools with high growth and high achievement in the charter world in Ohio, 93% of the charter schools sit below the state achievement 50 percentile. And in reading, 44% of them sit in the low growth and low achievement quadrant. These we consider to be the schools of greatest concern because they're not equaling what the students would learn even in their traditional school environments, which means that year over year over year, they're actually falling further behind. So their chances of actually rising in the achievement distribution are about nil. Let me tell you what that story is for math as well. That story in the bottom, so it turns out just 93% of the schools fall below the midpoint of achievement, again, for math. But this time, 48% of the charter schools in Ohio are in the mocha chocolate box. The good news is that in both of these, those that are in the high growth and low achievement, because their growth is higher than average, eventually if they keep that up and they can perpetuate those kinds of gains, those students actually do rise in the achievement distribution. So the peachy box there and the pinky box there are schools of hope that continued efforts and continued exercise with those students means that those students have a better chance of rising to levels of achievement that actually give them strong post-secondary options. So with that, I'm going to take it to a wrap and give you just a few points that summarize what we've talked about. There have been efforts in Ohio to improve the quality of schools. Some of those achievement results, some of those attempts have actually only occurred in the last few years, and they don't show up in our data yet. But those that occurred in the middle of our data window, we don't see a whole lot of positive impact for those efforts to date. We think that urban charter schools are doing better than the state as a whole. And we think that Cleveland is an especially positive story, but the rest of the state, the results are either neutral or mixed. We think middle schools are producing the best results. We don't know whether this is a protracted effort on the part of elementary schools to improve in the traditional sector, or whether we have just inferior models in those settings, but only middle schools are outproducing and outperforming their traditional schools when we look at grade span. We know that Cleveland charter schools help black students. The rest of Ohio, that's a neutral effect, so that's a plus for the charter schools here. Regardless of setting, charter schools do not serve Hispanic students very well. Poverty is a bright spot, and across the state there are positive results. We don't find those results in Cleveland, but when we look at black students in poverty, Cleveland really stands out. And when you think that that's the majority of the students that are attending charter schools, that is a strong statement of success in Cleveland for the students that they serve. And finally, we don't see much in terms of Hispanic students in poverty. I didn't share special education results with you today, but they're about the same across the state, except for in Dayton, where they just knock it out of the park. We don't know why, worth an extra look. And English language learner students are completely neutral across the state. We have no positive impact or negative impact. There's no effect. So again, we've got some concern, a group of schools in both reading and math where they're just not keeping pace at all, and there's really an opportunity to take a deeper look at what happens to them. We think that there's an expanded need for attention to quality. And I know that there's been a lot of talk about authorizing. Authorizing is certainly one of the places where we can have increased focus. We also think that the charter school boards of directors are a place where really close governance needs to have a second look. We need to find out whether the boards are truly independent, whether they are capable, and whether they are, in fact, exercising their governance responsibilities. Just looking at these data, I have to say that there's room for improvement. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Everybody want to take a deep breath? All right. Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we are enjoying a special forum with Dr. Margaret Raymond, Director of the Center for Research on Education Outcomes at Stanford University. We encourage you and invite you to formulate questions for our speaker now and ask that your questions be brief and to the point and, in fact, be questions. Be sure to tune in to our Friday forums on 90.3 WCPN, WVIZ PBS 104.9, WCLV Idea Stream, that's our primary media partner, or one of the many radio stations across the region and country that carry City Club programs. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Next Tuesday, December 16th, the City Club hosts our final program of the year, a panel discussion reviewing the Year of Zero Waste with Sustainable Cleveland 2019. For more information about that program or any of our upcoming and past programs, please visit us online at cityclub.org. Dr. Raymond appears today as part of the City Club's Education Innovation Series, sponsored by a generous grant from the Nordson Corporation. We thank you very much for your support. We also welcome guests at tables hosted by Breakthrough Schools, Cleveland State University College of Education, Cleveland Transformation Alliance, Friends of Breakthrough Schools, Nordson Corporation, Northeastern Ohio Education Association, and the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. Thank you all for your support. Also, we welcome students from West Geauga High School to today's program. Student participation is made possible by a generous gift from the Mary Jane Spar and Charles E. Spar Charitable Trust. We thank you very much for your support. And now it's time for our traditional City Club Q&A. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding our microphones today are Content Associate Teddy Eisenberg and Marketing and Outreach Specialist Kirsten Pianka. Do we have our first question?
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. When we in medicine think of twin studies, we think of comparing twins who live in the same family, in the same neighborhood, usually go to the same schools, have similar food intake. I mean, whatever you want to compare, they are in the same environment as compared to twins who are raised separately. When I look at your study, you're saying that because they have the same starting test point, that they are therefore equivalent. And I would like to suggest and ask for your comment, so it's sort of a question, that the student who goes to a charter school has a different set of parents, a set of parents who are looking more in depth at the school options. And I would like to suggest that therefore you have a more motivated group going to charters, and that makes your rather depressing outlook with 3% of the charters below average. I would say that that's even more depressing, and ask for your comment on that.
So obviously, the twin studies that you're describing have access to a whole lot more micro data than we do. And we are limited by essentially what's publicly collected on students in order to make our matches. What I would say is that we restrict the match pool to those schools that those charter school students would otherwise have attended. And so we're talking about a highly localized community. And if you actually look at census data in the micro community level, you end up with very, very similar populations of students, particularly if you've matched on all of what we call the observables. Now, there still may be something about family background, but I would take that on in the following way. First off, I think a lot of traditional public school parents are making active choices to keep their students in the traditional school. And that can be for a lot of reasons. We haven't, until very recently, had confidence that parents were choosing schools on the basis of academic quality anyway. And so parents have either a philosophical preference for public schooling, or they have a preference for a location or a part of the city. They have affiliation for schools that they themselves had attended. There are lots and lots of reasons why parents can choose schools. And so I don't actually think that the combination of the availability of choice and the starting background score differentiates students all that much. I think anybody who's got a feeder pattern that looks like a charter school and has the same starting score, we view what that accommodates in terms of family background and motivation and endowments for starting as a starting point for education to be equivalent. Now, it could be that in some larger universe, if we had another 100 variables to match on, that we would find that there are deeper divisions. But what we've been able to find is that students that go back and forth between charter and traditional schools, who are the ones who look just like traditional public school students and just like charter school students, their performance is about the same as their twins in both places. So we're not convinced that we've got a selection bias in charter schools at all.
So on page 8 of the report, it states that 33% of Cleveland's charter schools have significantly more positive learning gains in reading and math, and only 6% have significantly lower. But the sample only has 15 of Cleveland's 73 charters. So it's 5 have significantly higher learning gains. So is there any evidence that those 15 charters are representative of the charter landscape in Cleveland as a whole?
So this question was raised yesterday as well, and we haven't had a chance to dig into it. But let me explain what it takes to get into that table to begin with. We have to have, so your number of charter schools actually reflects the number of charter schools that exist today. What we have is we have to have 2 years of tested grades in a charter school that was operating at least 2 years ago. So if you have to wind the time back a little bit in order to figure out which schools have tested students that have 2 years of data for 2 years in a row. So we think the 15 schools that we have are all that we've had to work with so far for this test. Let me finish. And we will go back and look and see whether the schools that are not included are somehow different dramatically than the ones that we were able to include. Those other students are included in the overall Cleveland results when we talk about the student results, so we know that those are robust. It's just when we roll up to the school level, we have certain conditions that we have to have in order to be able to figure out whether the school is in fact a significant performer or not. I think there's one over here.
Dr. Raymond, thank you for all the research and the facts and analysis that you're providing. If I could ask for some conclusions. Here in Cleveland, you talked about the Cleveland facts. The breakthrough charter schools and other high-performing schools here in Cleveland, do you feel that they're providing a benefit to the community? And if so, how do you feel that they should be financed?
Did the breakthrough people put you up to this by any chance?
He's on the board.
Thank you, John. So, as I said at the outset, you know, we're not pro-charter, we're not anti-charter, we're not pro-district, anti-district. We're for great schools for kids. And I think in both the traditional sector and in the charter sector, schools that are doing an outstanding job contributing to student learning ought to have rewards. And I think that's a reward at the human capital level in terms of enriched compensation and, you know, greater flexibility at the school level to, you know, innovate. And I think it's also on the side of giving permission for them to expand, to take that message either through tutorials to other schools or opening new schools and expanding so that more students can benefit. I'm agnostic about whether you become the tutor for all the bad charter schools in town or whether you take your time and open a new school and serve that average number, which is lower than a traditional public school. I'm agnostic about that. But I do think that it's an encouraging point that state policy ought to support to make the greater performing schools in the charter sector and in the traditional sector be the ones to lead the way towards greater reform. Are you happy, John?
I'm
Good.
sure he's very happy. Hi.
Hi.
First, based on these results, I'm hoping that the state will look at putting a moratorium on opening any new charter schools until they figure out how to help them be more successful. But my question is, when you first began, you said that something, and I'm paraphrasing, that you felt the socio-economic factors were secondary to the cognitive and academic factors. And that's what it sounded like. You said something similar to that.
May I clarify?
Yes, yes, indeed.
Okay, what I said was I think there are lots of other outcomes for kids that we might care about, including socio-emotional learning and the ability to get along with others and cooperate and collaborate and resiliency. So we would call these non-cognitive skills.
Okay.
And those are the ones that I say, yes, I think they're important, but I actually think that they're secondary to what kids know, because it's what kids know that determine whether or not they can lead successful lives.
Well, the reason I'm asking the question is because when you say they're secondary to what kids know, it's like saying someone who has diabetes is secondary to the condition of their health. Those factors determine if a child is able to learn or not. And so I'd like to have your comment on that. So when you say it's secondary, to me, I have a problem with that statement. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes, but I don't hear a question.
The question is, I want you to comment on if you feel that the socioeconomic factors determine whether a child is able to learn or not when you say it's secondary to what a child knows.
Sure.
Do you understand what
Yes.
I'm saying?
Yes.
Okay.
Let me translate that into pointy-headed academic terms.
Okay.
I think what you're asking is, do we know the causality between what a kid knows and his non-cognitive skills? Is it a chicken or an egg? Do the non-cognitive skills set the conditions for learning, or does the knowledge coexist with those other skills? Is that the question that you were trying to ask? Okay. The answer is, I don't know. I don't know that we have spent a lot of time trying to do that trade-off between those two sets of skills. And in fact, we're only now in the 2010s really deeply focusing on those non-cognitive skills, and don't even have great measurement tools yet to be able to collect those and analyze those on a widespread and reliable basis. So I look forward to actually getting an answer to that. I think we're still a few years away from that.
Hi.
Hi.
First off, thank you very much. I think we're all here because we want to see kids learn better. So that's the first thing. Secondly, you said no names, please, basically in terms of charter management organizations, who's better, who's worse, et cetera. I am assuming that you do have that data in terms of which schools you're comparing and which schools. Are there plans to make use of that for future studies? Do we need to bug the foundations to get those studies out there? I mean, in your conclusion, talking about this is how we're going to improve is by encouraging the positives and discouraging the negatives. Is there a plan to release that data on that kind of basis?
So in 2013, we did a national study on charter management organizations, and we defined CMOs as any network that had 3 or more schools. We have, and in that report, Volume 2, Appendix A, we name names, and you're welcome to go to credo.stanford.edu and go fetch that little report and take a look for yourself. It's on that basis that I was able to say that I do know a little bit more about some of the CMOs that operate in Ohio. We have a long-standing practice in our research of not naming schools. And the reason for that is because we are concerned that justice might be a little too swift in terms of immediate repercussions. And we are not market makers, we are information producers. We did not want to take the role of influencing the course of schools because of the research that we do, because our focus is actually on trying to influence the policy environment, not to affect the fates of individual schools. So we will not be releasing names of individual schools, but CMOs, it's open season.
Yeah. Hi.
Hello.
How are you, Raymond? What I'd like to know is if you've done similar studies in other states, and if so, how do the Ohio results stack up against those? And what, for you, given the national landscape, are the implications more specifically about public policy in Ohio around charters?
Great. I think that's about 3 questions, so let me see if I can break those up. In our 2013 national study, also available at credo.stanford.edu, we found that there was a wide variation across states in terms of their performance. And there were some really, really strong performers, places you might not think of, like Rhode Island and Tennessee and Massachusetts, and Most Improved Player Award goes to District of Columbia, where their authorizing environments have been very, very focused on quality, and it shows up in the results that they have. And then we have some states that are really not anywhere near as good as Ohio. And all I can say about Ohio is that you're really glad there's Nevada. What I think this says for the policy environment is that a lot of these legislation enabling charter schools were drawn up at a time when people had really, really strong confidence in the power of markets. And I have to say this is one of the big insights for me because I actually am kind of a pro-market kind of girl. But it doesn't seem to work in a choice environment for education. I've studied competitive markets for much of my career. That's my academic focus for my work. And it's the only industry/sector where the market mechanism just doesn't work. I think it's not helpful to expect parents to be the agents of quality assurance throughout the state. I think there are other supports that are needed. Frankly, parents have not been really well educated in the mechanisms of choice. And I think that there's a lot of confusing information that they have to work with. And so I think the policy environment really needs to focus on creating much more information and transparency about performance than we've had for the 20 years of the charter school movement. I think we need to have a greater degree of oversight of charter schools, but I also think we have to have some oversight of the overseers. I think as I said earlier, I think the focus on authorizing is a place where those high-performing states have really been very deeply attentive to their authorizers and how they perform. They hold their authorizers accountable. And this new revelation for me about boards of directors is a whole new thing for us to think about. But when we look at the nonprofit sector, in community-based organizations, we can see that strong boards make a huge difference in the success of organizations, not only in terms of fiscally well managed, but also in terms of their effectiveness as an organization. That doesn't typically happen at the staff level. That's a board function that actually is created and is expected of the organization. So I think that this is an area where I think everyone can benefit if we have a little bit more attention to board development.
Good afternoon.
Hi.
Ohio has recently gone to a new teacher evaluation system, which has received mixed reviews, to say the least. I was wondering if your study does or will ever consider the teacher and the teacher evaluation in your research.
So our current study doesn't. And in order for our studies to study that, we would have to be able to link students and teachers and be able to track teachers over time. There are very few states so far that have been willing to give researchers access to teacher data, and there are very few subjects and grades where we can actually do that kind of study. I think at this point I don't know enough about the teacher system, teacher compensation system or evaluation system in Ohio to have any comment. But I know that it's a challenge that we're all trying to work on to be able to recognize good teaching, reward good teaching, and take appropriate steps when we find that that's not happening.
Thank you for coming to Cleveland. This is sort of a follow-on question to the one that I heard earlier. You have some concern about the boards of charter schools, and I wonder if you could expand on that. But I'm wondering also if your data differentiates at all between not-for-profit and profit charter schools, and also whether there's differences because of the authorizer.
Okay, that's two questions. The first one is we do not make a distinction, we do not break out profit and nonprofit schools. So we have no contribution to that particular question. We do, however, have a whole section of the report that I didn't even talk about today on authorizing. And we do, in fact, evaluate the quality of the portfolios of authorizers by what kind of authorizer they are, higher education, nonprofit, LEA, and so on. I'd encourage you to take a look at that. We had originally thought that the closer you were to education as an expertise, content expertise, might have a role to play, and in fact we find that's true. Nonprofit authorizers as a group do not perform as well as those that have some kind of affiliation with education. But the other part that we thought was an absolute certainty that we would see in the data did not show up, humbling moment, and that was we thought that size would matter in terms of how large a portfolio the authorizer had. And we find that that's not the case. That the sort of conventional wisdom about authorizing is that there's a certain scale you need in order to have all of the right content and expertise areas covered. But it turned out that we have really high-performing small authorizers and we have really high-performing large authorizers and poor of the same size. So there doesn't seem to be a function of size. It does seem to have something to do with education expertise. And it does seem to have something to do with a consistent attention to quality and a willingness to take action. So I encourage you to take a look at that part of the report and hope that that actually makes a helpful contribution to the debate.
Thank you very much, Mackie. Today at the City Club, we have been enjoying a special forum featuring Dr. Mackie Raymond, Director of the Center for Research on Education Outcomes at Stanford University. I think true to CREDO's expectations, you will receive praise and detraction from both sides and every side. Thank you, Dr. Raymond. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Our forum is now adjourned.